Download this code and get free GPT-4o from codegive.com, link in the description below. Tutorial: Learn Azure Functions with Python v2. Azure Functions is a serverless compute service that lets you run event-driven code without having to explicitly provision or manage infrastructure. In this tutorial, we will set up Azure Functions to run Python code locally and provide some examples. Prerequisites: 1. Python. Make sure you have Python 3.6, 3.7, or 3.8 installed. You can download it from python.org, https://www.python.org/downloads. 2. Azure Functions Core Tools. This is a command line tool that helps you develop Azure Functions locally. You can install it using npm node.js package manager. Make sure you have node.js installed, then run. 3. Azure subscription. If you plan to deploy your functions, you will need an Azure account. You can create a free account here, https://azure.microsoft.com/n-a/free. 4. Visual Studio Code. Optional, although not strictly necessary. Using Visual Studio Code with the Azure Functions extension makes developing and deploying easier. Step 1. Create a new Azure Function project. 1. Open your terminal or command prompt. 2. Create a new directory for your Azure Functions project. 3. Initialize a new Azure Functions project. This command creates a new project with the necessary files for an Azure Functions application. Step 2. Create a new function. 1. Inside the project directory, create a new function. 2. When prompted, choose a template for your function. For example, you can select HTTP trigger to create a function that responds to HTTP requests. 3. Name your function, example myHTTP trigger. After running these commands, you should see a new folder named myHTTP trigger in your project directory. This folder contains the function code and configuration files. Step 3. Examine the function code. Open the myHTTP trigger /_init_.py file. You will see a basic structure for an HTTP triggered function. Explanation of the code. The function logs a message each time it processes a request. It checks for a name parameter in the query string or the request body. If a name is provided, it returns a greeting, otherwise, it returns a 400 error. Step 4. Run the function locally. To run your function locally, use the following command in your terminal. This will start the Azure Functions host. You should see output indicating that your function is running, including the URL for the HTTP trigger, example http://localhost 7071/API/myHTTP trigger. Step 5. Test the function. You can test the function using a web browser or a tool like curl or Postman. Using a browser. Open a web browser and navigate to. You should see a response like. Using curl. You can also test it via the command line with curl. Step 6. Deploying to Azure. 1. Log into Azure. Follow the instructions to authenticate. 2. Create a resource group. 3. Create a function app. 4. Deploy the function. 5. Access your function. After deployment, you can access your function using the URL provided in the output. Conclusion. In this tutorial, you learned how to set up Azure Functions using Python v2, create a simple HTTP triggered function, run it locally, and deploy it to Azure. You can explore more triggers and bindings to create more complex applications. Further reading and resources. Azure Functions documentation, https://docs.microsoft.com/n-a/azure/azure-functions. Azure Functions Python Developer Guide, https://docs.microsoft.com/n-azure/azure-functions/functions-reference-python. Azure Functions Core Tools, https://docs.microsoft.com/n-a/azure/azure-functions/functions-run-local. Feel free to explore more and create your serverless applications with Azure Functions.